In your AQA anthology, there are 8 poems by Ann Duffy to be studied for your GCSE literature exam. Ann Duffy has written a lot of books of poetry, and this small selection of her work is designed to be an introduction to the typical ideas, feelings and styles that you'll find if you read more of her. You'll find your own favourites among the 8 poems, but you do need to know that 6 of the poems are particularly important because it's from this list of 6 that you will find a named poem in the examination question. The 6 poems that are particularly important are Before You Were Mine, Anne Hathaway, Havisham, Education for Leisure, Stealing and Salome. Although you're studying Ann Duffy as an individual poet for your GCSE, remember that you'll be asked to write about only one of her poems in the exam. This is because the exam is designed to test your ability to compare poets and to compare poems. Students who are studying Ann Duffy will be asked in the exam to compare one of her poems with a poem by Simon Armitage and with 2 others from the pre-1914 bank. Although the Duffy poem will be chosen for you in the exam, you can decide which Armitage poem to compare with it, and you can choose also the 2 pre-1914 poems as well. So it's up to you to choose poems that will go particularly well together, and this video aims to help you to choose effectively. So let's make sure you know what you have to do. In the exam, you'll have to write about 4 poems, 1 by Ann Duffy, 1 by Simon Armitage, and 2 from the pre-1914 bank. If you choose the question of Ann Duffy, the question will tell you which Duffy poem you must write about, but you choose the rest yourselves. You'll have 1 hour to do this, but you should spend some of the time choosing the best poems and writing a plan for your answer. This poetry question is worth more marks than anything else that you'll do as part of coursework or examinations in English or literature. The poetry answer, which takes an hour, is worth 40% of your marks for literature, so it's worth getting it as right as you can. It's also worth remembering that you don't have to write the same amount on each of the 4 poems that you write about. It's expected that you may well want to write about the Ann Duffy more than the others because that's the one that you've studied in detail. But there's no expectation that you'll write either in as much detail about all of them or write as much about any of them. What really matters, though, is that you compare these poems, because comparison in literature really does matter. The more you can find similarities and differences between the writers and between the poems, the more you're likely to get a good mark. Remember, the word compare will be in every question on poetry in your GCSE literature exam. GCSE literature questions come largely in one of 3 kinds. It's fairly obvious, but one kind of question is usually about the content of the poems, what's in the poems, attitudes, ideas, feelings expressed by the writer. A second kind of question is focused more on how they've used the language and how they've used poetic devices in order to express those attitudes, feelings or ideas. And then a third type of GCSE question moves away from the writer and the poem, perhaps to the reader a little bit more. So you may be asked about your response to what you've been reading. In a bit more detail, if we look at these 3 kinds of question, it's worth thinking about the sort of things which you may be writing about and can prepare in advance. If you look at questions about content, and we're thinking about feelings and ideas and attitudes, it's worth establishing what the difference is between a feeling and an attitude. A feeling is an emotion that may be short-lived. It may be something to do with an event or a person who suddenly takes your attention. But an attitude is something that lasts longer. It's more fixed. It's something that's developed over time. And it's to do with the way in which you look at the world and the way in which you present yourself. Ideas are very different, I suppose, because ideas are more to do with the way in which we understand things or explain them. Here are 3 examples of feelings, attitudes and ideas being made the subject of GCSE literature questions. First one. Compare the feelings expressed in Before You Were Mine with the feelings about a close family member in a poem by Simon Armitage and 2 poems from the pre-1914 bank. Or another example might be, compare the idea of doing something unusual in Education for Leisure with ideas of behaving unusually in 1 poem by Simon Armitage and 2 poems from the pre-1914 bank. Or a third example, you might get something like this. Compare the attitudes to relationships in Anne Hathaway with the attitudes to relationships in 1 poem by Simon Armitage and 2 poems from the pre-1914 bank. The second kind of question is the question which is about how the poems are written. And this relates to language, form and structure, and also relates to interpretation. Language is the most important of these 3 because it's the detail of language that's often the most expressive, and it's the pattern of language that really lets you say something important about the skill of the writer. Writing about use of language in GCSE literature is much more important than counting how many syllables there are in a line, or listing the rhyme scheme, or explaining that a sonnet has 14 lines. Those are things that are true of the appearance of poems. They're things that meet the reader's eye. But language gets beyond the eye, into the memory and into the reader's imagination. So language is to do with choice of words. It's to do with word order, and it's especially to do with imagery. Form is the visible shape or pattern of a poem. The form is rather like what you get in a silhouette. Structure is different. Structure is the way that the poem is developed within the form. Structure is what you tend to get in an X-ray. Let's look at an example of a question, which is of this second type, which asks candidates to look at how a poem is written. You might get something like this. Compare the ways in which Ann Duffy uses language to convey character in Salome with the ways language is used to convey character in 1 poem by Simon Armitage and 2 poems from the pre-1914 bank. The third kind of GCSE question in literature is the sort that asks about your response to the poems. It may ask whether you agree with what the poets have to say, or whether you disagree with them, or how they've changed your thinking, or how you see them as relevant to your life or to the world around you. An example of this kind of question might be something like this. Write about the way you respond to Ann Duffy's treatment of family relationships in Before You Were Mine, and the way you respond to a poem dealing with family relationships by Simon Armitage and 2 poems from the pre-1914 bank. In all of your preparation for the literature exam, it's worth remembering that the whole of the assessment of your work is controlled by 3 things. They're called the assessment objectives. The first is to test whether you can respond sensitively and critically to details in your reading. The second one is to see whether you can make some comment on how language, form and structure contribute to meaning, and whether you can offer alternative interpretations. And this tape is going to encourage you to think about your own interpretations from a number of choices. And the third of the assessment objectives is the one that's to do with comparing poems. When you're comparing poems, remember, you can compare anything. You can compare the attitudes, the ideas, the feelings. You can compare the use of language, the form and style, and you can compare your preferences for 1 poem to another. Before we look at the individual poems, it's worth thinking about Ann Duffy as a poet and the kind of things that she's interested in writing about, particularly in the 8 poems in this anthology. There are 3 broad categories that I think summarise her interest. She's interested in childhood and relationships within families, and you see this in Before You Were Mine. You also see it in Remember Your Childhood. And what she's good at, I think, is showing the fondness and the friction that operates within family relationships. She also writes about imagination, the way in which in people's heads sometimes there is a life either hidden or just about to emerge. And sometimes in some of these poems the imagination is something which makes you think that there's something rather murky or devious going on inside the character's head. And a large part of the interest of these 8 poems is the subject of relationships between men and women. Several of the poems show women coping with, surviving, or sometimes triumphing over the men in their lives. And you can see this in Havisham, Salome and Hathaway.